Hello and thanks for tuning in. My name is Coach Pav and today I'm going to be discussing how you can cope with the taper tantrums. So I'm going to start right at the beginning of all this because I'm sure there are people out there that maybe don't know or are a bit confused about what a taper actually is. I'm also going to go through how you can start to look at building one and personalizing it to you, because like almost everything, training, nutrition, mentality, everything that I go on about all the time, it's all individual. You're going to find that something that works for you is going to be completely different to everybody else. So a taper is simply a reduction in the amount of training or the intensity of the training that you are doing leading into your event. Now the point of the taper is to kind of shed as much fatigue as possible, refill your muscles and all your stores with glucose or glycogen, and make sure that you're peaking towards your event. So you've probably heard of the term peaking. Now typically what we look at with a taper, almost all my athletes will reduce the volume of your training. So if you're doing a 8-hour week, the week that you taper into, if you're doing just a week taper, is probably going to look incredibly less. You might only do sort of 3-4 hours into that, and it might kind of curve off as well. So you might still do a longish ride the weekend before, might not be consistently as long as your other long rides, and then you might do some 45 to an hour sessions, maybe 2 or 3 during the week before your kind of activation session the day before your event. It really does depend on how much training you've been doing and what your event is. The reason we keep the intensity in typically is because you want your body to remember what it is like to kind of perform at that intensity. So typically what I tend to do is I marry the intensity of the taper intervals with the intensity of your event. So if you're doing a sportive or something like that, then a tempo zone 3 kind of intensity is probably going to be good enough. But if you're doing a typical hill climb race in the UK, you might actually be doing quite hard intervals. Of course, they're very short. They're not long at all. There might be a couple of minutes maximum. There might only be, between 3 to 6 intervals. The rest of the time is going to be recovery or, zone 2 at maximum. I often always say that you probably need to be indoors to complete your taper. That's the same reason as I suggest that you do your recovery rides indoor too. And that's just that when you go outside, it's super hard to make sure that you're at the right intensity. And when you're not, you're actually introducing too much stress. And the whole point of the taper is to reduce and remove all the stress and allow your body to recover fully ahead of your event. Now, why do we taper? Great question. 5 to 6% are the quoted, claimed improvements that you can get from a successful taper. And when you really think about it, that's honestly quite a huge amount. And you'd probably do bad things to get that. So it's really worth playing around with and developing this in much the same way as you would develop most other tactics, techniques, the training and the nutrition mentality on your journey towards that. So why don't we taper for all events? And that's a great question. You ideally, and this comes down to how you prioritize your events, you're probably only going to have about 3 main A goals for the year, the ones that you really want to do well for. And those are the ones you're going to taper into. Now, obviously, what a taper is actually less training. And so what you're doing technically is getting some reversibility. So if you were to taper for more than 3 events, say maybe 4, 5, 6 or more, you're actually not going to be doing the training, and you're going to see a gradual drop off in your performance as you go through your season. So we make sure that you're actually only tapering a big taper, a full taper, for maybe 3 events in your season. Now, how do you build your own taper? It's so difficult to really actually do, and there's athletes that will spend many years building that and working with a coach to develop that. I always recommend that you start with looking at your recovery weeks as that base point. Now you're going to have a recovery week, potentially every 3, 4, and maybe 5 weeks. And the sessions that you do in that recovery week are obviously about shedding as much fatigue as possible in order to be able to be fresh enough to hit the next block of training. So you could quite easily start to develop mini tapers in this time, working out what sessions actually you need to do to be able to peak your fitness without actually risking too much reversibility, because that time is actually specific for recovery. Now, how are you going to notice or know for sure? Well, at the end of that week, you might do a test session, which you might repeat every easy week, and see what actually happens. Do you feel good at the beginning of it? Do you get an increase in performance? Whatever that test might be. Are the sessions before that actually working out, and are they doing what they're supposed to do? Now, another way is to use stuff like B or C events, which are less important events, and do mini tapers into them too. Again, you're not going to want to do a full taper, and you want the timing of this to be right, which is crucial, but they can ultimately serve as a really good base focal point for you to be able to develop that taper. Now, of course, again, you might be someone who's sitting there and they're like, well, I think I need more than a week taper, which obviously means that your recovery week isn't going to be appropriate enough. Now, there's ways you can manipulate that, for example, doing more in the block before training-wise, so that you actually need a longer recovery period, but that might not be the best because you might not be getting the quality of the training. So what you can do though is try and work out whether or not you're starting that next block fully fresh. If you're not, and you're still carrying a bit of fatigue, and maybe it takes half a week before your sessions are really high quality in that block, then actually maybe you are someone that needs 10, 14 days or even longer as a taper. Ultimately, another way of looking at it is you can just check and see how much your load is. Now, if you're looking at stuff like training stress score, which is an estimation of the stress that each session plays on that, and you can build that out into weeks and even blocks of training, you can start to look at how that correlates with how your performance is. And if you look, and you can judge based on the previous blocks leading into your A event, whether or not you think you need a bit more time. So plenty of ways in which you could start to play around with that. But ultimately, if this is really confusing to you, reach out to me, reach out to a coach, and see if there's some advice that you can get. So next, obviously coming on to what taper tantrums actually are. Now, I can't remember which of my clients first used this expression, but thank you to whoever it was that did, because I absolutely love it. And it's really apt for the majority of people who are training. Now, of course, most people kind of get quite addicted and into the rhythm of training on a regular basis. And when you get to a taper, you're not on the bike as much. And often what that does is gives certain people an itch, and they get irritated really easily because they're not able to train. And for some people, that's obviously a massive release, and gives you a lot of pleasure from riding your bike and suffering. So what tends to happen with some people is that they get really pissed off with it, and they can get quite frustrated and become moody, and that's where the taper tantrums come from. So what can we do to make sure that we avoid that? And I love to talk with my clients about this, because there's loads of ways in which you can be benefiting from this reduction in time, particularly in recovery weeks too, where there might be less time on the bike. And you can think about learning methodology, talking with your coach about why it is that we're training in a certain way. And you can develop your understanding of that. You could be developing your nutritional practices, learning to cook, understanding how it is that you can best support your training with your nutrition, or anything along those lines. Sometimes that might be too much for you. That might be something that you can't really commit to. So what else can we do? Why not watch pro cycling, read a book, go for a walk, or even have some family time? Family time might be a really good opportunity in here, especially if your family are going to be being a bit lenient perhaps with you, being away for potentially days or even weeks of your summer, and away from the family. So buy some kudos and some goodwill from your family now, which you might be able to use a bit later on. And that's it. That's my brief video on how to cope with the taper tantrums. I hope you've resonated with this. If you're somebody that's just watched this and you go, well, actually, I get to my taper and I love it, then fantastic, good for you. But some people really get pissed off, and I hope that if you're that person, you've found value in this video. So if you have, please make sure you give me a thumbs up and share with your friends. Hop over to YouTube. Maybe you leave in the comments exactly what you do during the taper or your recovery week to make yourself occupy yourself so you're not getting the taper tantrums. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Coach Pav. Have an awesome day.